Okay, so as I said, we're talking about blindness today. And I want to start by just thinking how much we rely on our sight. Imagine not having your sight. It would be a very, very different way of navigating the world, wouldn't it? So here's my first little exercise. And I wonder if I can have a volunteer. So what we're going to do, I've got a tablecloth and a little table setting, and we're going to set this table, but you're going to do it blindfolded. Okay? So I've got, my daughter bought me this in Japan. So yes, so let's see, yes, put your glasses away safe and turn you around. And let's tie this at the back loosely. Oh, yes, yes. So how are we going?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so let's see if you can first of all find the things that... So yes, you know there's the piano there. That's it. Oh, very good. That's a good start. No, you don't need that one. Just that one. Okay. So putting the tablecloth on the table. You're doing pretty well. Good. Is he cheating, do you think? All right. All right, good. So now we're going back for the setting. We've got a knife and a fork and a spoon and a plate and a cup.
Okay. Are they all the same place?
So, well, you're going to have to find them, aren't you? Yeah, and you can take the plate too. Cool. Cool.
Spoon.
Yes, it depends how you have your knife and fork, doesn't it? We all do it different ways. That is pretty good. Right, let's take your blindfold off. Let's have a look at your handiwork there. That's not too bad, is it? That's pretty good. Thank you very much.
I can remember that.
When I first did this exercise, I did it at the Red Cross with our Junior Red Cross. And I did it in a large hall with, I don't know, it must have been 50 other kids all trying to do the same thing at the same time. And I can tell you when I put the blindfold on, are you right? You dropped your glasses.
Do you put them in your pocket?
No, I put them there.
You're wearing them.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I put them on my head.
So when I first did this exercise in a large hall with all of these other kids trying to do exactly the same thing, I can tell you I put the blindfold on and I got completely lost. I had no idea where I was, what I was doing. We rely so heavily on our sight for all things. And I think it's probably relatively easy in a small space like this. But when you've got a larger space or you've got a house to move around, especially somewhere that's unfamiliar, you know, we find it very, very difficult without our sight. It's very interesting the way that when we don't have sight, what happens is our other senses step up and they become more refined and help us move around and do different things. So people will use their hearing very carefully. They will use the sense of touch to compensate for the lack of sight. Now, I just wanted to talk about one particular way that we compensate for the lack of sight, and that is reading. So most of you will be familiar with how blind people read. Do you know the system it's called the Braille system? Can I have my slide, please? So here is the Braille system, And of course, the black dots on the right-hand side of the chart are raised bumps, and they are felt by the finger moving across the page. I discovered a little bit about the history of Braille. Did anybody know the history of Braille? Kind of invented by this man, Louis Braille, who was himself blind, and he invented it at the age of 11. He started developing it at the age of 11. He finished when he was about 20. So really as a teenager he was developing this system. But he didn't actually invent it. He copied something else. So this was Napoleon Bonaparte's army, apparently, who realized that soldiers who were trying to read messages at night were vulnerable because they were having to look and they were having to use a light to read the message. And so they were an easy target for the opponent's guns. So a man in the army, his name was Charles Barbier, invented what he called night writing. And his original system wasn't 6 dots like that, it was 12. What Louis Braille realised was it was too hard to read because it was too hard. You couldn't actually feel the whole row, all of the rows with your single finger moving it along. You had to move it, much more up and down as well. So he invented this system where it's much reduced and it can be just touched by a single finger moving across steadily. It was a really interesting way that other senses come into play when we don't have use of our sight. All right, so we did that little activity with setting the table. The utensils and all the things we needed to put on the table are here and the table there. Do you think it would have been easier if I had guided you or instructed you in some way where to walk?
For such a small place, no. Big place, yes.
For a big place, yes. Yes, so you can imagine how easy or how much easier it would be to be guided along a particular route, to be helped along if you're not able to see. Things like being able to avoid obstacles in your way that might hurt you, trip you over, cause problems for you getting your task. If the knife was very sharp, you might cut your fingers on it, things like that. So to have someone talking you through, or even perhaps holding your hand and guiding you through the process would make it so much easier. But of course, what would happen if I were to give you this and I were also to use this one to blindfold myself? You see? So imagine I was also blindfolded. There's no advantage, is there? So it's very important for the person offering the guidance to be able to see. So this is why Jesus said things like this: let them alone, they are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. It's a very vivid picture, isn't it, when you actually imagine what it's all about. So I want to now talk on a different level, of a different kind of blindness. Business organisations and community organisations often have what they call a vision for the future. Have you heard of that? We've got one, in actual fact. So this is our vision as a church. That's our vision of what we see our future looking like. But of course, the reason we have that vision, we need some image, some picture in our mind of what the future looks like in order to be able to know how to move forwards towards it. This is on a more personal level. What do you want to be when you grow up? I wonder, adults, when you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you have anything in mind? You didn't? I had At one stage I was going to be a train driver, and then I was going to be a doctor, and then I decided I was going to be a musician, and then eventually I decided I was going to be a minister. But it took those, I was working my way through all of those other things. So then, and teacher too, I didn't think about that. Actually, teaching was something I didn't want to do. I was trying to avoid, but I fell into it and quite enjoyed it. Can I have my next slide? So the thing is that once you know what you want to become, the question is, how are you going to do that? You need some sense of what you're going to become in order to then understand the steps to get there. So if I was going to be a doctor, for example, I would need to study hard at school, I'd need to get good grades, and I'd need to go to medical school. And I understood that. So there you go. So we need some idea of what the future is going to look like in order to be able to move towards it. And this is a very important question for lots of young people. What am I going to be when I grow up? Because knowing that helps you know how you're going to live your next couple of years through your life. I wonder, what are you blind to? I think, like most men, I am blind to a certain amount of household dust. And to the blind man, the visionary is always mad. Now, whether the visionary is speaking about spiritual realities or speaking about some future state in the world that we haven't attained or achieved yet, I think that's true. To the blind, the visionary will always seem mad. But spiritually, the question is, what can't be seen? So we have this passage that I read from Exodus, which gives us some sort of sense of what is going on here. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. We are distracted by the things of the natural world. That's what blinds us and often causes us to forget the principles that we should aspire to or try to live by. And it's not always that the natural necessarily contradicts the spiritual principles. But if we're solely focused on natural things, there's so much that we miss because we don't have that higher perspective on life. And this is why Jesus says what he does to the scribes and Pharisees when he calls them blind guides. They have this fixation on the natural things of their religion, the natural practices, which lead them to forget the higher principles and wider, broader principles that they might keep in sight if they had the spiritual principles in mind. It's also why in the Old Testament we have this curious law which says that if a person is blind, he could not serve as a priest. It seems a trivial thing, doesn't it, to exclude a person from service in the priesthood simply because he is blind. I think I wouldn't qualify because I require glasses. What purpose is served by excluding someone who is physically blind from the priesthood? They may be indeed a very wise person, a very perceptive person. Well, it represents something. And it represents this idea of spiritual blindness being a limiting factor. So I just want to think about how this plays out for individuals. You know, we have this passage from Micah chapter 6, and you know it because I say it, so I read this one so often myself. We get so bound up in carrying out certain natural tasks and rituals that we forget the bigger picture that it's supposed to represent. We forget that there's a much broader category of activity that needs to apply to us, things that extend to attitudes, our beliefs, and simple decency in the way that we treat one another. One of the things I've noticed in recent weeks is the idea of karma, and the way the idea of karma just seems to lead people down a certain track of activity. So I'm thinking about people who I know who ascribe to the idea of karma and the idea of the needing to do good. And it seems to me, and I could be wrong, it seems to me that it leads them to kind of need to prove their goodness on almost a daily level. They need to be showing to the world that they are earning their good karma. And it's not that they're doing bad things, they're doing good things. But they've kind of lost sight of the purpose of it. Or they haven't been able to see beyond the kind of point scoring that goes on sometimes. It becomes more about measuring them as a person rather than the good that they are doing. And then during the week, I came across this video. It popped up on my feed. This is the International Near-Death Studies YouTube channel. And they keep serving me various things. And I saw this one, I think, on Friday. This lady called Michelle, and the title was, "I Had a Hellish Experience and Found God." And what she talks about is our need often not to see things. Our need to deny a reality that presents itself to us as blindingly obvious sometimes. She talks about the way, in her case, this led her down a path of dependence on painkillers and alcohol to try and avoid this thing in front of her that is presenting itself daily. The only way she felt she could forget it and felt like she could move on with her life was through the use of painkillers and alcohol. And I think it also leads to anxiety and it leads to depression. When we have this ever-present reality which is showing itself to us and yet we seek to push it down, we try to hide it from ourselves, we seek to make ourselves blind to it. I wonder whether when you were a child, you ever had a monster under the bed? Did you ever have that experience, a monster under the bed as a child? I did. I remember it quite clearly. And the thing I remember about the experience was I didn't want to look. Because I knew in my heart there was a monster under the bed, and if I looked and I could see him there, he would be terribly, terribly frightening. And I didn't want to look. But do you know what? There was no monster under the bed. And had I looked, what would have I discovered? I would have discovered there was no monster under the bed. And don't we spend our adult life doing exactly the same thing? Again, going back to Michelle, she talks about the need to be right, the need to win an argument as a way of finding self-validation because I don't really believe that I deserve that validation. This is one of the ways she sees this manifesting, and she talks about it in her own life. And so through this experience that she records in this video, she says this, she says, "I closed my eyes to an old reality and opened my eyes to a new reality that I did not even know existed." And I think we could all well do that. Open our eyes. See the reality that is in front of us, because often it is not as scary as we imagine it to be. And even if it is scary, the only way to move through it is to look at it, to see it for what it is, to understand it, and then from that point to know how to move forward, how to move beyond it. Because there's one other thing that Jesus said, and we have to ask ourselves, do we believe it? He said, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." How much do we really believe that statement? Because if we don't, we will spend our time, we will spend our lives seeking to be blind, closing our eyes to the reality because we believe that's a better way, an easier way of living. But I challenge you, reach out for those words. Understand what the Lord is saying here. It is a great, great promise.